In the application, if you'd like to create a card, the process is pretty straightforward, but I'm going to go over the different options that you have when creating a proprietary card. So this is not required for anybody that's using, bank cards or fleet cards or any sort of Visa, MasterCard type transactions. These are only going to be for your local proprietary card file transactions on the fuel site controller. So if you would like to enable those and you don't currently have them enabled, I would recommend you see our section on the proprietary card file setup so that you can have your site configured in the way that you would like it to have. If you aren't able to continue, you may need to stop here and go watch that section prior to coming into this card creation process. If you already have that enabled, great. Let's go ahead and create a new card. So right now we are under the cards driver vehicle records option here, and we're going to have a little plus symbol. So we're going to hit the plus. That's going to allow us to create a new card. Now we need to define what type of card do we want to create. Are we going to be creating a driver card or a vehicle card? So driver cards and vehicle cards can be treated in a couple different ways. We could use a driver card or a vehicle card as a single entry card, and there's an option right here for operates as single entry. That means that when I create this one driver card, this one card is going to authorize the transaction with just this singular card. There may be restrictions and other things on there, but it's only one card. So when we do that, we are basically saying if I give this card to employee A can take his card and fuel. There may be restrictions on his card, but as long as his card is considered valid and he selects valid products for something that he's allowed to fuel, then he'll be able to fuel. And you'll be able to generate a report on that particular person by running a driver report on that particular card. Now, that transaction is going to show as this card number fueled this quantity at this time, and this is the total. And that's what you're going to be able to see, and that's what you're going to be able to track. If we don't use it as a single entry system and we wanted to use it as a dual entry system, then what we'll do is we'll have a driver card and a vehicle card. So at the time of fuel, it's going to require two pieces of data to allow that transaction to go through. It's going to insert the first card, and then it's going to look to see is that card considered valid and any restrictions that are on that card, and potentially which account that card is in. And then it's going to look for the second card, and it's going to say, is this card valid and does it match that account and is there any restrictions? And once all of those checks are done, it's going to allow you to fuel. And what you'll be able to see on those transactions are this particular driver fueled this particular vehicle at this time. This is the quantity, this is the total. And that just gives you two pieces of data that you could track. So now you could track the drivers, you could track the vehicles. You can also track based on account if you're going to filter these by account. So there's a couple things to consider when creating cards. So the first thing we want to kind of go over is that initial proprietary setup. How are we going to use it? Are we going to use single? Are we going to use driver vehicle? If you want to be able to run a report on both, then I would recommend going driver vehicle. If you don't really care to generate a report based on the vehicle, like say you're just selling fuel to a neighbor company and you don't really care what vehicles they have, you're not really interested in that much detail, you just want to know how much do I bill this particular person, then you may want to go single card in the system, and you may not want to deal with the extra level of complexity for driver and vehicle reporting. It does give you a lot more flexibility, though, to do driver vehicle combination cards because you just have more data to report on. If you don't want to use all three card types, then once again, in the proprietary card setup option that we have for the other training, it will kind of go over how to turn and turn off those features so that you only are using single cards or that you're only using driver vehicle cards. So you can make that determination first so that this process is a little bit easier and streamlined the way that you want to use it going forward. So we're going to first let's just create a driver card. And when we do that, we are going to be prompted for several things that we need to fill out on this page. You can see right off the bat that there's a lot of different options here on what we can go with. So we have a status. So this is going to be, is this considered a valid card? If you don't want it to be valid, or you have an existing card that you need to change from valid to invalid, then we could simply come in here and put the status as invalid or one of these other predefined options. You'll see down here that you can have your own description for a problem, so we can customize this menu to say anything, but basically anything that's not considered valid in that first option is going to not be able to fuel. So we'll want to create this card as valid. The next, PIN number. PIN numbers are going to prompt you at the time of fuel for a PIN. So they're going to insert their card or type their number in at the time of fuel, and it's going to prompt them enter your PIN number. This is going to typically be like a 4-digit number that we're going to enter in here. So let's just say 1234, for example, is this particular person's PIN. Now, if they enter a different number, you'll have an opportunity to set up the system to either disable that card after 3 bad entries, or they'll have the option to just keep trying until they get the right password. So there are some other configurations that we can do for the PIN. Now, if you do not see some of these options enabled, then we may also need to jump into the proprietary card file setup and turn on or turn off features that you do or do not want to use. For example, for this PIN number, if we don't want to use a PIN number, then we don't need this option to be here. So we can simply jump into the organization settings and your card record settings and turn off PIN number. And then once again, you'll see invalidate the card after 3 bad entries is an option here. So if you don't want that, you could turn that off. If we don't want PIN number altogether, we'll turn that off and hit save. When we come back into the card menu and add a new card again, so now you're going to see that PIN option that was right over here is now gone. So the system is customizable, and you can kind of define what features do you want and what features do you not need, so that you can streamline this card creation process and make your cards as fast as you can. So I'm going to go through some of the other options. I've pretty much got everything turned on and enabled here that we have options for, except that PIN number obviously now. So allow miscellaneous entry. What does that mean? So the system has several predefined prompts that we can prompt for, and one of those prompts that we can prompt for is a miscellaneous keyboard entry. It's basically just going to prompt you for enter miscellaneous. Now, your installers can change that display message to ask for other things. So you may want it to say enter trailer number or enter invoice number, enter employee ID, whatever you'd like the format, the display to say, but it's prompting you for an additional piece of data. Now, the miscellaneous keyboard is not a verified prompt, so it's basically just prompting you for whatever, and they can enter whatever they'd like at the time of fuel. It's not going to deny them based on the entry. You're just asking them for the data, and if they give you the data that you want, or if they don't give you the data that you want, it's really not verifying any of that data. So, you just need to set it up to ask what you would like and hope that your drivers or your vehicles are being prompted for the correct thing and they enter the correct data in there so you could track it. So if you would like them to enter a certain number, you could turn this field on, and then when you have a transaction, it will have a miscellaneous keyboard entry field on that transaction that shows what they entered at the time of fuel. It will also give you the ability to see that data if you export it to a third-party program, for example, or into an Excel file. We're going to skip over second language. We're not going to really go into that right now. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to use this as a single card, you can check this box and it'll be single card. The system still labels single cards in this as a driver or a vehicle. So depending on your selection here, that single card will be labeled still as a driver or a vehicle, but the system will treat it as a single card entry system. If you want the cards to expire at a certain date, you can put an expiration date on them. And then once it hits that date, that card will be invalid. So if you wanted to have all of your cards expire in a certain time in the future, you can set up an expiration date. Once again, all of these settings that we go through here will need to be enabled on the fuel site controller in order for them to work in the way that you would expect. So if we have an expiration here, the fuel site controller doesn't have expirations turned on, then it's going to ignore that even though it's sending an expiration date. So once again, we'll just want to make sure that we visit the proprietary card file setup and that we set up the system initially to be able to read the way the controller is configured so that they're both synced and working in the way that you would expect. Over here on the right, here's where we're going to enter the details for this particular driver card, for example. So the first option is the driver ID. This number is going to be the number that shows up on your report and the number that shows up on your export if we export the data outside of the DXFleet application. So this number can be an alphanumeric number that allows you to do letters, numbers, or a combination of both. And this number is going to be what shows up on those reports. This number down here, the FSC presented media, this is the number that's being entered at the time of fuel. So this is going to be your keyboard entry number. It's going to be the number that's physically printed on the magstrip card or on your chip keys or on any of the file formats that we support. So this is the actual number that's being read. So for example, if you're using a magstrip card that's 16 digits, this would be the entire 16-digit string that's being read by that card reader at the time of fuel, and it needs to be accurate in order for you to be able to fuel. If this is going to be purely somebody that's going to go up to the system and type in keyboard entry, then we'll just put in whatever number they're going to type. And if they type the right number, it's going to be considered, valid, and then it'll look at all the other statuses and restrictions. So, for example, if we just want this person to enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the time of fuel, this guy will go up, or girl will go up to the terminal, type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it will look at all the other options and they'll be able to fuel. If we want it to show up in the report or export with the same number, you could simply put in the same number. If you want to use an alphanumeric string, you can do any combination of that here, and then this would be what's reflected on your report. Each card has some required fields. One of those required fields is the driver name and the short name down here. So you'll want to give your driver a name for the card. So this could be first and last name. The short name is just an abbreviated name. So this is going to be what the fuel site controller stores for this card, and I believe it's roughly 9 digits or less. So you can do, first dot last name. You could do, first last initial. You could do just the first name or whatever makes sense for your particular card setup. But it's just an abbreviated section. You will need to select what account this card is going to go into. So the accounts are the ability to filter who's able to fuel what and a way for you to track your transactions in the application based on the accounts that are fueled. So if you want to generate an account report, for example, for every particular driver or vehicle in a certain account, then you would want to make sure that your cards are set up in the correct account here. We have several different account options, so you can create your own account. You can use no associated account, which may be a global system user, so they'll be able to fuel and cross-fuel amongst different accounts. Or you can create your own accounts that you would like to filter and sort them through. So we're going to have your driver name, short name, and account selection. These other options here, card user 1 and card user 2, are custom fields that you can put and store additional information in the application. They're not tracking anything. They're not allowing you to restrict anybody. These are just additional pieces of information that you would like to store with the card. So a lot of people may set these up to be, cell phone number. And you can change these under the settings menu, organization, user strings. Here we have our card user 1 and our card user 2. So if we were to change this one to cell phone and then hit save, and then we were going to go back to our cards menu add a card. Now we have a cell phone option here. So it's a simple way to track some additional information that you want to store with the card, and we can change these names and customize what you would like it to show up as. Once we have the top portion filled out here, now we're into the restrictions section. If you don't know how restrictions work, please see our other video on the quantity restrictions, product restrictions, and odometer restrictions. Here we're going to have a quantity restriction. These do need to be set up before you can have these selections, so you'll want to make sure you set those up in the proprietary card file setup that we were just in. So under quantity restrictions, if this is selected, this particular driver will only be able to get whatever the quantity that is restricted here. So 20. So this is 20 gallons per transaction that this person can fuel. If they go over that, immediately the terminal will stop that transaction at 20. Product restrictions are the ability to have a allowable list of fuel types that these people can fuel. So if, for example, if I select an unleaded restriction, this means that this particular driver can only fuel unleaded pumps. If they select a pump number that's associated with a different fuel type code, then they will be restricted. Allocation, daily allocation, monthly allocation is simply, do you want them to have a daily limit and a monthly limit of how much fuel they can get? The daily limit and the monthly limit are just going to keep an ongoing total of how many transactions or what the quantity and price of the transactions are. And if they hit that limit, they're going to be restricted, and it's not going to allow them to fuel until either we clear that limit out of the system or until the next day or the next month rolls around, and in which case they will be able to fuel. So, for example, if you wanted somebody to have a daily limit of 500, you could. If you wanted to have a daily limit of 100, it's just as simple as that. If you need to have allocations turned on, then it is required for everybody to have an allocation. So if we're going to say some people are allocated and some are not, the system will need a value here because it will be tracking everybody based on allocation. So some users may want to come in and just set a really high allocation amount that nobody's actually going to hit. So that would make your user basically unrestricted for allocation. They can get 9,999 gallons before they're restricted, kind of thing. So you can do that if you need to enable allocations for some people and not others. For the most part, if you don't want to use allocations, we will leave these off. And then we would come into the card record option and we would just simply say we don't need to use monthly and daily allocation. And then those features would just simply be gone, and we would not need to select those restrictions. The last thing here under the driver card is a fuel zone. A fuel zone allows you to set which fuel or which sites rather are this card going to be sent to. So if this card is in a zone that says fuel all sites, that means this card is going to every site that you have in the application. If you set it to one zone or another zone, any site that's in that zone would get this card update, and any changes to this card would be sent to that site or any site in that zone. So if you would like to use zones to restrict which cards are going to be authorized at which site, we simply just need to define those zones. If you want to set up the zones, it's under Settings, Fuel Zones, and then you could simply create and then select a name and then select which sites are going to be authorized for that zone. We do have an extended prompts option under the driver card as well. If you want to prompt for a certain prompt at the time of fuel, then these are another way to do that. This prompt can be verified or it can be unverified, which basically means if it's verified, then you're going to put in the value that you need it to match. And if it's unverified, then they can put in any value that they would like at the time of fuel, and it's not going to restrict them. So in order to use extended prompts, it needs to be turned on for the prompt sequence on the fuel site controller. But then we would come in here and say, we want this card to prompt for, say, odometer, or we want to prompt for, some other number here, like say driver's license number. Now, if we want to use those as verified, we just need to turn on the verified option here, and then we're going to enter what verified answer, basically, does this need to match. So if, for example, we're using driver's license number, then you could put in this particular person's driver's license number, and they would need to type it in the same way for it to be able to accept that as a verified prompt. If we don't want to verify, then you could just simply turn those off. You also have an option of what order do you want this prompt to go in. So, do you want this to be the first prompt or the second prompt? And you can define that here. We're going to jump over to vehicle cards. So now we're going to create a vehicle card in the system, and that's going to show you just about the same thing, but maybe a little bit different options here. So we still have our quantity restrictions and our product restrictions and our zones, and the only thing that's a little bit different is we have a odometer restriction here. So if we're going to use odometer restriction, we need to turn on allow odometer entry. So this is going to prompt them for odometer at the time of fuel, and they're going to need to put in that odometer value of their particular vehicle. You can also do that in the prompts. If you wanted to allow odometer in the prompts, you could, or you could just enable it here. So we do have a B prompt for odometer if you'd like to use that. And then jumping back over here, so we have allow odometer entry, and then we'll need to put in a value for the particular person's odometer in order for them to be prompted correctly. So you'll want, best practice is to go ahead and enter a particular vehicle's odometer when you create that vehicle card. If you don't know that odometer, that's okay. It needs to have at least a value of 1 in order for it to prompt for a valid odometer. If you are using odometer restrictions, then you will need to make sure that this number is accurate, because if they put something outside of this range that you are restricting them by, then it will restrict them. So just something to keep in mind, that if you set these up, you'll want to make sure that this number is valid and accurate. You'll also want to make sure, if you're restricting them, that your drivers are entering the correct vehicle's odometer value at the time of fuel. And that's what we've got for the card creation process. Once again, if you have any confusion or if your menus look a little bit different, please see the proprietary card file setup on the other training video.